Your destiny is reflecting in the chrome surfaces of the future, waiting for you to step forward and claim it. Join us for the stories of those who dare to take control and rewrite their own history. Click subscribe now and start building your own cinematic legacy today. My father gave the toast at my brother's wedding rehearsal dinner and didn't mention me once. Not once. There were 47 people in that private dining room at the Ashford Club, and my father stood up with his glass of Bordeaux and talked for 11 minutes. I counted. About my brother, about what a remarkable man he'd become, about how proud it made him to see his son standing on the edge of such a bright future. He talked about my brother's promotion to senior partner at 31. He talked about the client portfolio my brother had built from scratch. He even told a story about a little league game in 1999 that I'm pretty sure he'd revised significantly in the retelling, because in my memory, my brother struck out twice. I sat at the far end of the table and smiled and clapped with everyone else. I was good at that by then. I'd had 33 years of practice. My sister-in-law-to-be caught my eye once during the toast. Her name was Ingrid, and she'd been in my brother's life for 2 years, but we'd only met a handful of times. Their relationship had moved fast, and somehow the timing never worked. She gave me a small, uncertain look, like she wasn't sure what the expression on my face meant. I smoothed it out immediately, smiled at her, raised my glass when everyone else raised theirs. Later at the bar, my mother found me and said, "You look tired. Are you sleeping?" That was her version of hello. "I'm fine," I said. "You should try magnesium. Your brother swears by it." She paused. "He mentioned you might be between projects right now." Between projects. That was the phrase she used for what I did. Like I was a freelance photographer or something, waiting around for the next gig to come through. I wasn't between projects. I hadn't been between projects in 6 years. But I'd stopped explaining that to her a long time ago, because explaining required details, and details required her to actually listen, and listening had never been my mother's strong suit when it came to me. "I'm not between projects," I said. "Good, good." She was already scanning the room for my brother. "He's just so busy with the merger, you know. I don't know how he does it." I ordered a club soda. I watched my mother drift back toward the center of the room, toward the gravitational pull of her son, the one she'd always orbited. I thought about leaving. I thought about the 2-hour drive back to the city, my apartment, my dog, my actual life. I thought about what my therapist had said in our last session. You don't have to keep showing up for people who don't show up for you. But I stayed. Because I always stayed. Because some part of me still believed that one day it would be different, and I didn't want to miss it if it was. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand how long this had been going on. My brother is 4 years older than me. His name is Declan, and he is objectively talented and hardworking, and I want to be clear that I don't blame him for most of this. He didn't ask to be the favorite. He didn't ask for the way our parents lit up when he walked into a room, or the way they went slightly dim when I did. Some things just happen in families, quietly, and without anyone deciding to let them happen, and by the time you're old enough to name them, they're so woven into the fabric of daily life that everyone acts like they've always been there. Declan was good at school in the ways my parents understood. Grades, rankings, test scores, the language of achievement that translated cleanly into pride. I was good at other things. I built things. I took apart the family's VCR at age 8 and put it back together because I wanted to understand how it worked, and my father's response was to ground me for a week for touching his things. I stayed up late reading about how the internet was structured, about protocols and systems, about the way information moved through networks. I built my first website at 11. Nobody cared. When I was 15, my father sat me down after my report card came out and told me I needed to focus. "You're smart," he said in the tone of someone pointing out a minor asset. "But smart doesn't mean much if you don't apply it to something real."
I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then that saying things to my father usually made them worse. The summer before my senior year, I interned at a small tech startup downtown. I worked 70-hour weeks for no pay. I learned more in 3 months than I had in 3 years of school. When I came home and tried to tell my parents about it at dinner, my father talked over me to ask Declan about his law school applications. I'm not telling you this to get sympathy. I'm telling you this so you understand that by the time I graduated college, I had already accepted the reality of my family the way you accept the reality of a chronic condition. You don't cure it, you just build a life around it. I moved to the city at 22 with $11,000 in savings, a laptop, and a very specific problem I wanted to solve. The problem was this. Small businesses, especially restaurants and retailers, were bleeding money because they couldn't afford the kind of inventory and supply chain software that larger companies used. Enterprise systems cost $250,000 to implement. Nobody was building anything for the middle market. The tools either didn't exist or were so complicated they required a full IT department to run. I thought I could fix that. I was wrong the first 2 times I tried. The third time, I wasn't. By the time I was 26, I had 12 employees. By 28, I had 43, and we'd closed a Series A. By 30, we had 211 people across 3 offices, a product used by over 8,000 businesses in 31 states, and a valuation that made me slightly uncomfortable when I thought about it too directly. I didn't tell my parents any of this. Or rather, I told them at the beginning, tried to, in the way you try to explain something to someone who isn't really listening, and after enough conversations that went nowhere, I stopped. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was more like a door that slowly swung shut. My mother knew I worked in tech. My father knew I ran a small company. Declan knew slightly more because he'd asked once, genuinely curious, and I'd told him a little. But even Declan was busy, and busy people don't always follow up on the things they learn about people they've already filed away. I kept my professional life and my family life in separate compartments. It was easier. It was survival. The only person in my family who ever asked real questions was Ingrid. She'd started dating my brother when I was 31. I met her for the first time at Christmas, and she came in with a bottle of wine she'd clearly researched because it was exactly the kind my mother liked. And she shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said, "Declan talks about you. You built a company, right? What does it do?" I almost dropped my eggnog. I gave her the short version, the 3-sentence pitch I'd refined over years of networking events. She nodded the whole time, actually tracking what I was saying, and then she asked a follow-up question. A real one, about the specific challenge of getting small business owners to trust new software, because her background was in financial services and she'd seen the same resistance there. I stared at her for a moment. I wasn't used to it. Being asked, being followed. Exactly, I said. That's exactly the problem. We talked for 20 minutes. It was the best conversation I had that Christmas. It was possibly the best conversation I'd had with anyone in my family's home in years. But then dinner started, and my father made a toast about Declan's recent case, and the room swallowed her back up. And I filed the memory away like something fragile. The wedding was in May, at a vineyard about 40 minutes out the city. The venue was beautiful. I will give my mother that. She'd spent 8 months planning it, and it showed. String lights in the old oak trees, tables set with wildflowers, the whole thing golden and warm in the late afternoon light. I was a guest. I wasn't in the wedding party. This hadn't been framed as a deliberate slight. Ingrid had 2 sisters and a best friend from college, and the party was already large. But my mother had still found a way to mention it 3 times in the months leading up to the wedding, always phrased as an explanation, never as an apology. The girl's side is just so full, she'd said, each time as if I'd brought it up. I sat at table 9. Table 9 was near the edge of the tent, close enough to the heaters that it was fine, but far enough from the main tables that you could feel the distance. I knew 2 of the other guests at my table, a cousin from my father's side, who I saw maybe once a year, and an old friend of my parents who seemed unsure who I was. The rest were Ingrid's extended family, the warm people who talked to each other in the easy way of people who actually knew each other well. I was fine. I'd made peace with the seating before I arrived, the way I made peace with most things involving my family, by lowering my expectations far enough in advance that reality couldn't disappoint me. The ceremony was lovely. Declan cried a little, which surprised me and made me like him more. Ingrid was composed and clear-eyed and said her vows like she meant every word. Dinner came. The speeches started. My father stood up. I reached for my water glass. 35 years ago, he began, I held a son in my arms and thought, this is what I'm here for. This is the thing I'll be most proud of. He talked for 9 minutes. I counted again. It's a habit now, the counting. Something to do with my hands. He talked about Declan's law career, about his integrity, about the kind of man he was. He called him his legacy. He said he couldn't imagine being prouder. He told a story about a father-son fishing trip I hadn't been invited on. He thanked Ingrid's parents. He thanked the venue staff. He sat down without looking at me. The applause was warm and genuine. My cousin from my father's side patted my arm briefly, and I couldn't tell if it was sympathy or just contact. I smiled. I clapped. I was so good at it by then. Later, during the cocktail portion, I stepped out to get some air near the edge of the vineyard. It was dark enough past the string lights that I felt invisible, which was exactly what I wanted. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing, telling myself it was fine. It had always been fine. I had a whole life that had nothing to do with this. There you are. I turned around. It was Ingrid. She was still in her dress, holding a glass of champagne, looking like someone who'd temporarily escaped her own wedding reception. Congratulations, I said, and I meant it. Thank you. She stood next to me, looking out at the dark rows of vines. I've been trying to find you for an hour. I'm not very findable at these things. She laughed a little, not unkindly. I noticed. A pause. Your father's toast. It was nice, I said. It didn't mention you. I didn't say anything. I'm sorry, Ingrid said quietly. I don't want to make this weird on today of all days. I noticed. I wanted you to know that I noticed. Something tightened in my chest. I wasn't used to being seen in this family, not even adjacent to it. It's fine, I said. Really, your company, she said, and her voice changed slightly, became more careful. Declan told me a little. Meridian, right? The supply chain platform? I looked at her. Yeah, I thought that was you. I wasn't sure. She paused. We use it. At Hartfield. Hartfield was one of the largest regional grocery chains in the Mid-Atlantic. Over 300 locations. You work at Hartfield, I said. Director of Operations. She took a small sip of champagne. We brought Meridian on 14 months ago. Changed everything about how we handle seasonal inventory. I've sat in a dozen meetings where people talked about how much they loved it. She looked at me steadily. I didn't know it was you. I didn't put it together until about 6 weeks ago when I saw a press profile. I didn't know what to say. I never know what to say when this happens, when the two halves of my life accidentally touch. Does Declan know? I asked. I mentioned it. I think he didn't fully. She stopped, started again. I think your family has a particular way of understanding you that's hard to update. That was an extraordinarily gracious way to put it. Yeah, I said. Your software serves 8,000 businesses, she said. One of them has been mine for over a year. I've talked about it at company all hands. I've used it to justify a $30 million inventory restructure. She shook her head slowly. Your father just called your brother his legacy. The word landed the way she meant it to. Not cruelly, just honestly. I know, I said. I think you deserve better than what this family gives you, Ingrid said. I'm going to go back to my reception now because I have a husband in there who is probably getting emotional at the photo booth, but I wanted to say that. She touched my arm briefly, the same way my cousin had, but this time I knew exactly what it meant. You built something real. I've seen what it does. Don't let anyone make you small. She walked back across the grass toward the lights and the music, and the laughter. I watched her go. I stayed outside for another few minutes. The vines were dark and very still. Then I went back inside. The moment came 20 minutes later and I wasn't prepared for it. I was standing near the bar, talking to Ingrid's younger sister about something I can no longer remember, when I heard my father's voice cutting through the ambient noise nearby. He was talking to a man I didn't recognize. Silver-haired, well-dressed, the kind of confident posture that usually means old money or very comfortable new money. Remarkable young man, my father was saying. Just made partner. You should see the cases he handles. The silver-haired man nodded politely. Then he glanced past my father and looked at me. His expression shifted. "Excuse me," he said, and he stepped around my father in a way that was not quite rude but was definitely deliberate. He walked directly to me. "You're the woman behind Meridian," he said. Not a question. I felt something happen in my chest. "I am," I said. "Clifford Haynes," he said, and he extended his hand. "Haynes Distribution. We've been on your platform for 8 months. I was going to reach out next quarter about expanding to our Canadian operations." "I know Haynes Distribution," I said, because I did. Every account over a certain size I knew. "We should talk." "We absolutely should." He seemed delighted. "I had no idea you'd be here. How do you know the family?" I glanced over his shoulder. My father was standing very still, holding his drink, watching us. "I'm Declan's sister," I said. Clifford Haynes' eyebrows rose. He turned to look at my father, then back to me. "You're—" He stopped. "You're Robert Calloway's daughter?" "I am." He shook his head, smiling in a way that was almost puzzled. "He was just tells me about his son." "He didn't mention." "He doesn't always," I said. I kept my voice light. I was careful about that. There was a small silence. My father set his glass down and walked toward us. "Clifford," he said, with the careful cheer of someone recalibrating. "I see you've met my daughter." "Your daughter," Clifford Haynes said, and there was a particular texture to how he said it, "built one of the most useful operational platforms I've come across in 15 years. We've restructured our entire fulfillment process around it." My father looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't twist the knife. I wasn't interested in making it ugly. I was just tired and honest and done performing for people in this particular room. "I didn't know you knew Clifford," my father said to me. "I didn't. We just met." Something moved across his face. I don't know exactly what it was. Something slow and complicated. Declan appeared at my side, because Declan had been watching from across the room and had apparently decided to insert himself, which I will always be grateful for. He put his arm around my shoulders and said to Clifford, "My sister's the one who should have been in the speeches." It was the most generous thing he'd ever said to me in front of our father. My father didn't respond. Clifford Haynes laughed warmly. "I don't disagree. My mother found us eventually, drawn by some instinct for the center of gravity. She looked at the configuration of us. Me, Declan, my father, a man she didn't recognize who was clearly treating me with great deference, and something uncertain crossed her face. "Who's your friend?" she asked me. "Client," I said. "Your daughter runs Meridian," Clifford told her, in the friendly tone of someone sharing good news. "My company has been on the platform for most of this year. Extraordinary product." My mother looked at me with an expression I can only describe as recalculating. "She's always been so clever," she said finally, which was the closest she'd ever come to a compliment, and which landed about as well as you'd expect. Declan found me near the end of the night when the dancing had started, and the fairy lights were all that held the dark back. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He was quiet for a moment. "How long has it been that big?" "The company?" "A while." Why didn't you tell us? I thought about how to answer that honestly without destroying his wedding night. I tried, I said, for a while, and then I stopped. He looked at me for a long time. He had the same eyes as our father, but he was wearing them differently tonight. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't pay enough attention. You were busy. That's not an excuse. No, it wasn't. But I appreciated him not pretending otherwise. Ingrid's wonderful, I said. She's going to be good for you. She likes you a lot, he said. She has for a while. She kept telling me to reach out to you more. He exhaled slowly. I should have listened. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need to be filled. Can I come visit? He asked. Your office, I mean. I want to understand what you built. Yeah, I said. You can come visit. He hugged me then, briefly, a little awkwardly, the way brothers and sisters hug when they've been not quite close for a long time. It was enough. It was more than I'd expected from the evening. My parents called me 2 weeks later. My father, which was unusual, he almost never called directly. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation at the wedding. He said he'd looked up some things online. He said the numbers were, he used the word impressive, carefully, like he was handing me something fragile and wasn't sure if I'd take it. I listened. I didn't make it easy for him. I didn't make it hard either. I just listened. I didn't understand, he said, what you were doing. I should have asked more. He wasn't wrong, and it wasn't enough, not by itself, not after 3 decades, but it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years, and I wasn't going to refuse to hear it. I know, I said. There was a long pause. Your mother wants to come see you, if that would be all right. I looked out my office window. 12 floors up, the city moved below me, 8,000 businesses quietly running their inventory on infrastructure I'd built. There was a photo on my desk of my team at our last company, all hands, 50 faces grinning at the camera. Ingrid had texted me that same morning about the Canadian expansion. I'll think about it, I said, which was the most honest answer I had. I don't tell this story for revenge. I never needed the revenge. I had my work, my team, my actual life, built on my own terms, far from the dinner tables where I'd been made to feel like a footnote. But I will say this. There's something clarifying about a moment when the life you built quietly and privately suddenly becomes visible to the people who chose not to look. You don't owe them the view. You've earned it for yourself, regardless. Declan came to the office 3 weeks after the wedding. He walked through the floor, looked at the whiteboards and the people and the systems, and he shook his head slowly. You really built all this, he said. Not a question, just absorbing it. Yeah, I said. He turned to me and said, I'm proud of you. And I believed him. Because he'd earned the right to say it. Not because he was my brother, but because he'd chosen to actually show up and see. That's the thing about pride that people in my family never quite understood. You have to earn it by paying attention. I paid attention to myself for 33 years when no one else in that house would. That was enough to build something real.